Change is coming by disaster or by design.
We hold the power to change the political calculus in America.
We have power. We have so much power.
So we will vote, we will resist, we will hug trees, we will stop our own polluting, we will boycott companies that pollute.
The seas are rising, and so are we.
We're gonna go raise a ruckus.
This really marks the escalation of Fire Drill Fridays.
And you know, so much of my hope also comes from watching how ideas move from the shadows and the edges and the margins towards the center.
Our social movements have grown exponentially.
Don't blink, don't back down from this fight, because when it comes to us and climate deniers, we will win politically and we will win on the policy.
Woo! Yes, we have the power to make changes, right? And we need to build a better world. So I'll see you next time. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, and welcome to all of our regular firefighters. And to those of you joining for the first time, welcome to the Fire Drill Fridays family. We are about inspiring action to end the fossil fuel era through storytelling, building community, and a little sass. Each of you can help us build our movement. You know what you can do to help right now? Share today's rally so your friends and family can join our movement. It's going to take a lot of us. And it would be really great if you could let us know in the comments why you're here. How did you hear about Fire Drill Fridays? Thank you. And by the way, just to brag a little, already this new year in 1 month, Fire Drill Friday has had 390,657 views. It's the first Friday of February. And for those of you who are new, every first Friday is a rally. We try to approximate the feeling of a rally, the spirit of a rally, which means we have a very enthusiastic virtual audience to cheer us on. And as with live rallies, there aren't going to be any audience questions. So the Biden administration has really come out with all guns blazing when it comes to climate, right? He's issued executive orders on a lot of what he promised during the campaign, certainly more than any other president has ever done. But let's keep in mind that this has happened because of decades of brave and creative activism. Biden didn't start out as a potential climate president. He was made into one by activist pressure and by the science. He finally listened to what the scientists were unanimously saying, that we have little time and must reduce our carbon emissions by half by 2030 if we're to keep warming at 1.5 degrees Celsius. That's what the science says. Now, for today's rally, we're focusing on 4 important things that we need the administration to follow through on fast if the United States is going to meet its climate goals. 1, we have to make sure that the Biden-Harris commitment to a worldwide ban on fossil fuel subsidies is followed through on. Fossil fuels are a glaring example of corporate socialism in this country, right? Or in the world, in fact. US federal and state governments underwrite them every year with $20 billion in taxpayers' subsidies and tax breaks. You know that during the past decade, the US fracking industry lost $300 billion, but it was continuing to produce thanks to government subsidies and investors. See, we're totally enabling them. The International Monetary Fund reported that $5.2 trillion went from world governments to the fossil fuel industry in 2017, 10 times what was spent on public education. This shows what a stranglehold those companies have on our political bodies, and it's got to stop. The next issue that we're going to address is exports, crude oil exports. Many countries, especially the US, Russia, and Canada, seem to be counting on export markets to justify increases in fossil fuel production. So we're asking the Biden administration to reinstate the crude oil export ban of the Obama administration and expand it to cover gas. The climate crisis is a global crisis. And while this country moves rapidly to reduce carbon emissions, carbon consumption, right, through our use of renewable energy, if we continue production of fossil fuels for export to other countries so they'll can burn it, the world will not be able to meet our carbon budget. Then another issue we're going to address today is our precious public lands. President Biden announced last week that he's pausing new oil, gas, and coal leases on federal lands to the extent possible. And he said he's putting the US on course to protect 30% of public lands and oceans by 2030. Now, about a quarter of this country's planet warming carbon emissions come from coal, oil, and gas extracted on public land. So this is important, and it's definitely worth celebrating. But he hasn't banned oil drilling on public lands as he promised during his campaign. And existing permits for fracking aren't going to be impacted at all by his announcement. So we got to keep the pressure on until he makes good on his promise. Next week, we're going to be talking about projects that should be canceled, like Line 3. It's an oil pipeline underway in northern Minnesota that violates indigenous rights and would carry the pollution equivalent of 50 coal power plants. And finally, we're going to talk about environmental justice. As Gina McCarthy, Biden's new White House National Climate Advisor, said, quote, "Climate is a racial justice issue, and solving it advances justice and creates union jobs." I mean, when was the last time we heard a high-level government person say words like that? It's so exciting. But the Biden administration has pledged to direct 40% of climate and clean energy investments to disadvantaged communities. So we're going to be talking about why this is so important and why we really need to hold his feet to the fire on this. Cancer studies in Houston, Texas found that living within 2 miles of the shipping channel's petrochemical complex was associated with a 56% increased incidence of childhood acute lymphocytic leukemia compared with those living more than 10 miles away. And then there's a new cancer cluster in Houston's traditionally African-American and Mexican-American Fifth Ward. Children there have contracted leukemia at nearly 5 times the expected rate of the general population. In 2020, a survey concluded that, listen to this, 43% of the area families had at least one member diagnosed with cancer. And speaking of Houston, our first guest is Rico Sisney, who will talk about crude oil exports, especially in Houston. Rico's a climate justice activist and vocalist with hip-hop bands Sidewalk Chalk and House of Wales. Rico got involved with Greenpeace over 10 years ago in support of local efforts to shut down 2 of the dirtiest coal-fired power plants in the country on Chicago's South Side. He was one of 22 activists who demonstrated at the Fred Hartman Bridge on the eve of the 3rd Democratic primary debate in Houston, calling for leaders to imagine a world beyond fossil fuels and embrace a just transition to renewable energy. And last year, Rico became the host of Greenpeace's environmental justice themed podcast, What We Need Now. But before we hear him, let's watch a short video about the powerful action he and other Greenpeace campaigners took in 2019 to stop fossil fuel exports in Houston.
We have seen a warming in our world like never before.
This town has seen 3 500-year floods in just 5 years.
It is the threat to every living thing on this planet, and we are running out of time.
We need courageous leadership. We can get this done.
A lot of the candidates on the stage have said climate change is a priority. And so what we want to see is, what does that look like? And how are you going to address the fact that the fossil fuel industry has bought our democracy in so many ways?
Hi, I'm one of the Greenpeace climbers under the Fred Hartman Bridge in Houston, Texas. We are shutting down fossil fuel traffic in the Houston shipping channel.
This is the largest oil export channel in the country. All of the major oil companies, Exxon, Shell, Chevron, they all depend on this terminal.
We have now shut down all marine traffic up the Houston shipping channel.
We're here today to put a stop to the fossil fuel industry and the damage they're doing to our planet.
We're here to also press our elected representatives, our next president, to push for a Green New Deal so that people working in the fossil fuel industry can get stable, high-paying jobs in renewable, clean energy. So that's why we're here. It's a little scary. It's pretty exhilarating.
This is definitely the outside of my comfort zone, but it is inherently risky to not deal with climate change. We are in a crisis. We are in an emergency. And so we're not talking about just what's going to happen for future generations. For people who are more marginalized, this is a reality. We're already there.
We're taking bold action to inspire folks to join the movement. There's many different ways to get involved.
We don't need everybody to do what we did today. Whatever is in your toolbox, whatever step you have not yet taken, we need you to take that step.
None of us are alone, and when we all speak up together, we can make these changes happen.
You can see very beautifully the sun is setting behind the oil refineries. Like the age of oil is coming to an end.
So it's been a little over 12 hours, and we're still here. It's possible to imagine something different.
And thank you, Jane, for that. And thank you, Fire Drill Fridays team, for having me. As many of you know, I'm a long-time listener, first-time caller, Fire Drill Fridays. This is an incredible lineup of speakers. I wanted to share an image that lives in my mind's eye that's kind of an accompaniment for the video that you just watched. It's a 360-degree view of the Houston Ship Channel. And, you know, I can kind of feel the gear on my body and the weight on the lines, and to my left and my right and directly above me are some of the most brilliant, brave, dope I know. Below me, the water is calm and quiet. There's seals swimming around and splashing in the water. Some people saw dolphins, which I'm actually very jealous of. I didn't see any dolphins, but the point is, it was beautiful. And I could anticipate feeling adrenaline rappelling from a 225-foot bridge. I could anticipate fear and dread being taken into police custody in an area in Harris County not too far from where Sandra Bland was killed. But I did not anticipate having any sense of peace 150 feet above the busiest fossil fuel thoroughfare in the country. And don't get me wrong, the skyline is full of refineries. There's the second largest petrochemical plant in the world is there. The air is thick. There's a smell. Brian asked the other day about what the air was like up there. It's not great. But while on a normal day, it would be busy and noisy with ship traffic, on that particular day, it was calm and peaceful. And so the reason I wanted to share that image is because we don't always have a concrete image of what a world beyond fossil fuel looks like, but it's what we're called to imagine. And part of the reason it's so difficult to imagine moving beyond fossil fuels is because the fossil fuel industry is so entrenched in our democracy, in our lives, and indigenous land, and the health of communities of color. And the lifting or the repealing of the ban on crude oil exports is an attempt by the fossil fuel industry to become even more entrenched at a time when most people agree we need to move beyond fossil fuels. So with that context, I wanted to share 3 reasons why the President Biden administration should prioritize reinstating the crude oil export ban. Number 1, lifting the crude oil export ban was a huge step backward. I'll put it another way. Without the crude oil export ban repeal, the United States would not be producing half of the oil it is today because it could not be exported. And those are not my words. Those are actually the words of Jim Teague, who's the CEO of Enterprise Products, the US's largest crude oil exporter. So the fossil fuel industry understands the significance of that ban repeal. It's why the American Petroleum Institute worked so hard to make it happen for 2 years. And since the ban was lifted in 2015, exports have increased over 750% from 400,000 barrels per day to close to 3.5 million. So how did we meet the increased demand? More infrastructure and more extraction. So companies have already proposed about a dozen new oil and liquefied natural gas facilities. We're seeing increase in fracking. Fracking in the Permian Basin and shale drilling in Appalachia are really helping to drive that increase in exports. And the Permian Basin is actually predicted to become the world's largest liquids producer in the next decade. So it would surpass Saudi Arabia. And the bottom line is, like, we don't need more creative and elaborate ways to extract. What we need is to invest those resources, that innovation, and that labor into improving renewable energy. So again, crude oil exports, huge step backward on climate when we can't afford anything but huge steps forward. Second reason they should prioritize it is that oil exports require exploitation of communities, just like so much of the fossil fuel industry. And a lot of the guests on this show, like I said, I'm a fan, I watch it. A lot of guests have talked about the connection between racism and environmental degradation, but it's worth repeating. Climate change and all of the inequality that goes with it is brought to you by white supremacy. On the Greenpeace podcast, What We Need Now, Ajua Adai referred to a crisis of not feeling. And she said, basically, you would have to lose your sense of feeling to see all of the oil and rivers and the toxic smoke and the smog and the wildfires and all of the harm and the health disparities and be okay with it. So we have never stopped treating certain places and populations as disposable, and that mentality is what leads to continued degradation of our environment. So just like the water protectors defending against Line 3 this week, we know that communities will fight back. Tejas fights back in Houston, El Viejo and Barrow in Chicago, and West County Texas and Richmond are examples of groups that have successfully fought against pollution and exploitation in their communities. And a lot of these efforts take decades. So by increasing the demand for exports, we're not only eroding some of the global impact of these hard-won victories, we're forcing communities into brand new battles to protect their land, their air, and water. So if you're asking how that can still be happening, the answer is racism. I'm gonna end with some good news, and it's the most important piece here. The Biden administration has the power to solve this problem. President Biden can declare climate change a national emergency, which would give the president authority to reinstate the export ban and access federal resources to rapidly deploy renewable energy. I hope that many of you watching would agree that national emergency is actually an understatement if we're talking about the existential threat that we face with climate change. So as Jane pointed out right at the top of the show, President Biden was made a climate president because of the work and demands of the voters and the climate movement. And that work continues. As you heard in the video, Tracy, one of the activists on the bridge, said that we literally watched the sun set on the fossil fuel industry on that particular day. And I hope you can hold on to the image that I shared at the beginning and your own visions of what the future we're fighting for looks like, because whatever your skill set or your interest may be, we're gonna need your help to create that future. So thank you for having me, and I'll pass it back to you, Jane.
Yes, sir. Yes. Go. Yay. Images. And so listen, we're kind of going to go out of order now because we are so honored to have newly elected Congresswoman Cori Bush as a guest, and she is in Washington, and there are a lot of important votes, and we know she's going to have to leave to vote. So she's going to come next to talk about environmental justice. Cori Bush is a registered nurse, community activist, organizer, single mother, and ordained pastor for the people of St. Louis, Missouri. She's now serving her first term as the first Black woman and first nurse to represent Missouri. Yay. Representative Bush has personally experienced being unhoused and evicted, and is a survivor of police, sexual, and domestic violence. And she centers those hardships in her fight for regular everyday people. Born and raised in St. Louis, she studied at the Harris-Stowe State University before receiving a nursing degree from the Lutheran School of Nursing. In 2014, following the murder of Michael Brown Jr. in Ferguson, you remember that, Cori Bush spent more than 400 days leading on the Ferguson front line as a nurse and clergy. And in the following years, she continued her activism as a co-founder of the Truth Telling Project and as a leader of the protest group Expect Us. Congresswoman Bush has received the 2015 Woman of Courage Award from the Emmett Till Legacy Foundation, the 2019 Herschel Walker Peace and Justice Award. She's been selected top nurse by the International Nurses Association. And in 2020, the Jefferson City NAACP awarded her their prestigious Trailblazer Award. Welcome, Congresswoman Cori Bush. Take yourself, yeah.
We're having some audio issues, Congresswoman Bush. We can't quite hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Switching systems, and it's just always, okay. Anyway, well, again, thank you so much, Jane, for the introduction and for inviting me to a Fire Drill Friday. It is always an honor to speak with fellow activists. So I have been clear since the day I took office that environmental and climate justice is racial justice. I come from the fight for Black lives, and as a Congresswoman representing Missouri's 1st District, I am legislating in defense of Black lives. Black Lives Matter means lead paint in our homes needs to be removed. Our utilities must not be shut off, and our chemical weapons must be banned. It also means ending fossil fuels. Ending fossil fuels. The climate crisis is a crisis of threats to Black and Brown communities, threatened in St. Louis. And let me say, by 11 more, it's threatening in St. Louis by 11 more 90-degree days per year than when I was born. 11 more 90-degree days. You know, I come from protest, and when people are out in the street, when I was out in the street, when I'm on that bullhorn, and you know, I will often ask, what is your work? That is a challenge to those out on the streets and to myself. What am I willing to risk? What am I willing to lose? What do I bring to this movement to move us closer?
Whoops.
Jane, it looks like we lost her. We might have to move along to our next speaker, and we can wait to see if she can pop back on.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Got a little glitch in DC. So I hope that we get the Congresswoman back. But in the meantime, I want to introduce Bryan Parras, who is a lifelong resident of Houston's historic East End barrios, a Mexican-American working class community. After graduating from the University of Texas in Austin, Bryan started helping organize cultural arts programs through Nuestra Palabra, Latino writers having their say. Mr. Parras became a co-producer and board operator for Nuestra Palabra's radio show on KPFT and started making his own media, turning the lens onto the community that he grew up in. He also began organizing with his father, who was focused on environmental justice issues in the community. When the city of Houston started construction of a new high school next to 3 petrochemical plants, Bryan put his media skills to work and began to document environmental justice stories. In 2005, Bryan co-founded T.E.J.A.S and started advocating for communities in the same East End barrio he grew up in. He created a DVD entitled After the Wind Child, After the Water's Gone, about the environmental health risks in storm impact zones in Louisiana. And in collaboration with Mothers for Clean Air Houston, he co-directed and edited a youth-driven video voice project about air quality in East Houston entitled Wish You Were Here, Stories from the East Side. Bryan is currently featured in the award-winning documentary, The Condor and the Eagle. Welcome, Bryan.
Thank you so much, Jane, and thank you all for joining us today and having me. I'm honored and humbled, and my mother made me tell you she's a big fan. Appreciate your lifelong activism and dedication. I'm from Houston, Texas, the occupied lands of indigenous peoples that have lived here for at least 15,000 years and continue to live here. T.E.J.A.S is a Caddo word that means friend or ally, and is a testament to the deep relationships that indigenous people cultivated across the continent. This land is not your land. This land is stolen land. This land is indigenous land, but all are welcome if you agree to live within the natural laws of this majestic place. Our history, identity, and culture is directly tied to this land. It is no wonder then that it is in indigenous communities that diversity of life is protected most. That all changed with colonization and the extractive economy that forcibly displaced, murdered, and forced us into bondage for the purpose of excavating the wealth from this land, or what our elder Casey Camp appropriately calls source of life. That history is important to remember because it is the forces of colonization, dehumanization, and unmitigated extraction that has brought us to this moment of global emergency. And only if we practice indigenous wisdom of humility and reciprocity can we live in balance with all of our relations. If you engage in this work, you also become a part of beginning the restorative justice that our communities deserve. That's why it's so beautiful to see this act of resistance and solidarity that Rico participated in. It was so inspiring, like spiders weaving down from the Hartman Bridge. They wove a collective message of resistance to this entire extractive economy, shutting down the Houston Ship Channel and causing us to reflect, if just for a moment, that another world was possible. The great taking could be stopped, and it was, if just for a few hours. Now, I grew up in Houston, and like many urban cities, there's a long history of racial disparities, and Houston is no different. We have seen that Jim Crow era policies have led to disproportionate impacts, and this is all on top of, the legacy of Houston's oil and gas, fossil fuel driven economy. We started working myself in the late 90s with my father because it was something that was not being done. And I remembered being sick often and having health impacts, but no one believing me. And I could smell the chemicals in the air and I would have the headaches and all of that, but no one believed me. So our first order was to get the data, right? We had to get the data. And it was this school that later became Cesar Chavez High School that really brought me, my father, and a larger community of folks that supported us together. And I want to pay homage to, other environmental justice leaders who have been doing work in this area for much longer than us, like Dr. Bullard, and many nameless individuals as well. But our work and our efforts collectively put pressure on the city that started a movement to look at the impacts that the petrochemical industry was having on the health of adjacent communities that are predominantly Black and brown working class families. In 2005, the TCEQ, this is the state agency that is supposed to take care of us, their own data showed concern for 3 specific chemicals: benzene, 1,3-butadiene, and formaldehyde. Combined, these 3 hazardous chemicals, if inhaled during a lifetime, would likely generate 29 to 199 additional cases of cancer in 1 million people. Under normal circumstances, there's a risk of 1 additional case of cancer developing in a population of 1 million. I say all of this because it's very overwhelming to think about the ramifications that this industry has had on our communities. And we have seen many struggles and many families and many people who have suffered the consequence. I wanna send some love to Valentin. It's one of the first young children that my father connected with, and his family. He's a survivor of childhood leukemia, but we also lose children too. And I wanna give love to Sierra Rose and her family. She lost her battle with cancer, and many families have had to go through the difficult process of wondering, how does this happen? How does this happen? How did we get here? And so this numbers and data has real impact on people's lives that I don't think, is said often enough. And when we look at really, really big incidences like what happened during Hurricane Harvey, and in 2019, a series of chemical explosions and disasters that rained black particulates across miles and miles of the city of Houston and burned for days. These have lasting impacts that go undocumented, that are not seen. And this is what drives, us to do this work. So recently you mentioned 2 cancer clusters that were found in 5th Ward area, communities like Kashmir Gardens. And there's communities that are organizing and starting organizations like Impact, to address these concerns as well. There are networks and coalitions of people working together, like the Home Coalition, to address these issues, but also to look at issues related to housing and other forms of inequities that compound, the impacts of these chemicals on our communities. Another organization, Living Hope Wheelchair Association, that works with disabled, undocumented immigrants. There are so many communities in our neighborhoods that are unseen, that are, have no voice, and that are also being impacted by these industries. So to conclude, I just want to say that we need all of you to join us in this struggle and support Black, Brown, Indigenous networks and organizations. But we ask that you show up in a good way, with good heart and good action. Be truthful, be vulnerable, and be joyful. If you do all of those things, I guarantee you will come to know resilience as we know it. In the face of impossibilities, you will move forward undeterred. In the face of calamity, you will act courageously, and your valor and dignity will bring comfort to others. Ometeo, Lakesh, thank you so much.
Woo! And thank you very much. Fortunately, we can welcome back Representative Cori Bush. Welcome back, Cori.
Thank you. So, you know, we just moved into a new office. Some things happened and we had to move into a new space. So we're trying to get used to the setup. So our apologies. But as I was saying before, first of all, that last speech was amazing. And that was just a lot of information that I would love to get later to get a better understanding of what's happening, especially in Houston. But as I was saying before, I come from protests. And when we are out there on those streets, I'm on that bullhorn and I'm often asking people, what is your work? Like, that is a challenge to those out on the streets and to myself. What is it that I'm willing to risk? What is it that I'm willing to lose? What do I bring to this movement to move us all closer to justice? You know, my mission in Congress is to do the most for every single person in St. Louis, beginning with those who have the very least. That work begins with dismantling white supremacy in all its forms, especially when it comes to our environment. For example, underground fires have been burning near radioactive waste at the Westlake landfill since 2010, and many people have not been able to move away from it. Ending environmental racism and fighting for environmental justice is a top priority. The work you all are doing is fundamental to this goal. That is why within my first month of being in office, I partnered with Senator Ed Markey to introduce the Environmental Justice Mapping and Data Collection Act. Our bill would federally fund and create an interagency committee to develop detailed maps of key indicators of environmental racism, such as air quality, fossil fuel infrastructure, and police violence that affect St. Louis and communities just like ours on a daily basis. These data will be used to help direct a minimum of $800 billion in clean energy transition funding to the communities most affected by these environmental hazards, including many in the St. Louis area. And that is just the start. I'm also serving on the Environment Subcommittee on the Committee on Oversight and Reform, where I will be fighting for climate justice and holding those who endanger our environment accountable. Oversight means making sure the work that our community needs gets done, making sure that it actually gets done. It means working in service of the people and the communities we represent, who all too often are on the front lines of our climate crisis, which you all know very well. We're a little more than 2 weeks into the Biden administration, and it's off to a promising start. It was great to see the historic nomination of Representative Deb Haaland as Secretary of the Interior and the creation of new climate advisor positions. But we have more to do right away. We cannot hesitate by allowing ourselves to say, well, this is better than Donald Trump's fossil fuel obsession. We were already way behind before him, and even more behind before that. So we need to do more now. We can both celebrate important actions President Biden has taken and immediately demand more, which I'm hearing that is what you all are doing. We can be happy that he finally shut down the violent Keystone XL pipeline. Now we need him to shut down DAPL, Line 3, Line 5, and the Pennies pipeline. Our indigenous siblings have been putting their bodies in front of construction this week to save their water and land. People are risking their lives for us every single day. Federal procurement of electric vehicles is an excellent example of what the executive branch can do. Let me say that again. It's an excellent example of what the executive branch can do. We must extend that energy to all federal vehicles and buildings by 2022. That is possible, and we cannot wait until we are stuck in new campaign cycles to get this done. President Biden and Vice President Harris have halted new oil and gas leases on federal lands, an amazing first step. Today would be a great day to stop current fossil fuel leases on public lands as well. Burning fossil fuels anywhere means dangerous heat and flooding in St. Louis and so many other places. So I am here to say it. I am here to say, and I'm here to stand in this way saying no more. Biden has committed to a civilian climate corps. And we need to hire 650,000 people by July to match the goals of the original program. We must continue to increase our ambition to match the gravity of this crisis and this decade of a Green New Deal. We must demand what we all need. We must cancel all pipelines and make sure that those workers have work. We must cancel all current leases and hire those workers to remediate pollution. We must decarbonize every building and vehicle we have jurisdiction over by 2022. And I repeat that question that I asked on the streets of Ferguson and at actions across this country. What is your work? As activists in the climate space, how will you continue to push elected officials? How will you continue to lead the way? How will you make the most of holding the House, the Senate, and the White House with a president who is committed to tackling climate change? Know that I am here fighting alongside all of you. I am forever in solidarity. I'm so grateful for the work that you all have done to make this moment that we are in today possible. And I cannot wait to see what change that we can make when our government and our movements work hand in hand. Thank you all for doing the work. Have a great one.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Congresswoman Cori Bush. And please stay safe. Stay safe. We know why you moved offices. Stay safe. Take care of yourself. Stay strong. I know you will. And our next speaker is going to talk about fossil fuel subsidies. We have Nicole, Ghio. Nicole has spent over a decade fighting deadly fossil fuel projects across the globe, as well as institutions, policymakers, and financiers that support them. She's led successful campaigns to force corrupt officials out of office and worked with a broad coalition of stakeholders to halt fossil fuel expansion in the US. As the senior fossil fuels program manager at Friends of the Earth, Nicole advocates for a just transition away from our dependence on dirty fuels that endanger our communities and our climate. Welcome, Nicole. Thank you for joining us.
And thank you. I cannot begin to describe how excited I am to be here and how excited I am to be here in this moment. The last 4 years have been very painful, I think, for all of us, and to see the possibility of change is really revolutionary. And I have to stress the possibility. Biden took historic action on the 27th with his climate executive order that is groundbreaking, that could revolutionize this country, but it was just the first step. And we need your help to follow through and make sure that those actions turn into permanent reality, turn into permanent reduction in fossil fuels, turn into permanent protections for communities, and turn into reparations for those communities that have been on the front lines and have borne the burden of our unjust dependence on fossil fuels. And so that's why we need all of you. And I'm happy to talk about one of those first steps, which is eliminating subsidies for fossil fuels. This is a direct support to fossil fuels that keeps these companies going. In 2020, we really saw the reality of this boom and bust industry. People like to say that markets are rational. The truth is that they're not. If you look at the history of the oil and gas industry, this is an industry that's always gone up and always gone down hard. And we're in a situation right now where so many of our communities are reliant on this insecure boom and bust industry, and we need to end that. We don't just need to end it for the climate, although we are all in big trouble if we don't. We do need to end it for justice because of the impact on those frontline communities, but we also need to end it because this is a cycle that's going to continue. It's going to endanger our schools. It's going to endanger our hospitals. It's going to endanger all of our services if we keep relying on an industry that is inherently broken and is very likely in permanent decline as the price of renewables falls. And if we keep subsidizing this industry, we're essentially allowing them to continue polluting, to continue killing people, and to continue pillaging our environment. So Biden's action on Wednesday starts to address the $20 billion in subsidies that we send to the fossil fuel industry every year. Now, these are the subsidies that we can quantify, where we can actually put dollar amounts on it. But how do you actually put a dollar amount on lives lost? How do you actually put a dollar amount on communities that face this burden every day? You can't. There have been different attempts to actually address and put dollar amounts on some of this stuff, which is a whole nother conversation. But the reality is that those are priceless. And so when we say 20 billion in subsidies, we're really just talking about a number that we can start to quantify. We're not actually even getting close to the impact of allowing an industry to pollute without repercussion, of allowing an industry to kill without repercussion. But if we start to go after those 20 billion subsidies, we can start changing the reality, the market realities that enable this industry to continue to damage our community. And Biden directing his agencies to go out and remove subsidies and to identify and end those subsidies by the 2022 fiscal year is big. But again, that is just a first step. It's up to us to actually monitor the administration to make sure that they actually are identifying and removing these subsidies, because a lot of these subsidies are actually just baked into the way our government operates. Terry's going to talk about one of the biggest subsidies that we send to the fossil fuel industry, which Biden did address directly, which is the federal fossil fuel leasing program that allows industry to essentially pillage our public lands for very little cost, below market rate, preventing conservation, preserving our public lands for future generations, and endangering communities. They were under Trump, they were continuing leasing under COVID. They were continuing leasing at a time when the only way that people could weigh in publicly during public comment periods was online, and when many of the communities most infected have some of the lowest broadband access in the country. It was unconscionable. And so Biden taking action to halt new leasing is big, but that kicks off a review period where we're going to actually have to hold him accountable and make sure at the end of that review period there are permanent solutions to address fossil fuel leasing, as opposed to just a temporary pause. Like, we need to make these permanent. We're going to need your help to do that. On a personal level, one of the most exciting things for me, and in addition to the leasing program, which is huge, and I'm so excited to hear Terry talk about it, is actually the movement to end subsidies going overseas. Since 2010, the U.S. has spent around $44 billion in financing overseas for fossil fuels. This is huge. Biden's action on the 27th, coupled with statements climate envoy John Kerry made on the 27th, shows that the U.S. is actually interested in addressing this overseas fossil fuel finance, which is something that we actually weren't expecting them to address so directly. This is exciting for me because this is something that I used to work on a lot. In a previous lifetime, I actually met with frontline communities. I've met with people whose family members have been disappeared to make way for fossil fuel projects that got funding from the U.S. government. I've met with people whose homes and schools have been destroyed to make way for these projects. I've met with activists who've been relocated multiple times for projects. I've met with people who live in areas that already exceed pollution standards set by their government, where they were planning to build the largest coal plant in the world. I've met with communities that were fighting new coal plants because they saw the impact happening in other countries and they didn't want this happening where they were. I've worked with activists whose entire communities were just excluded from environmental impact statements for projects that were financed by the World Bank. And so for the U.S. government to take action to both end U.S. Overseas fossil fuel finance, as well as to work with other nations to end public finance. This is government money, directly or indirectly, that's going to support fossil fuels is huge. Public financing institutions from G20 nations alone provide more than $77 billion in annual support for fossil fuels. And Biden just directed the U.S. government to use its diplomacy to help end public finance internationally. So not just the U.S., but work with other nations to end this, as well as directing the U.S. government to stop providing the $44 billion that we've provided since 2010, to cut off that chain. This could be groundbreaking, and it is exciting to see U.S. leadership again in this space. And it's also not new. As groundbreaking as this is, this isn't the U.S. going out and jumping ahead of everyone else. In December, the United Kingdom committed to a process to ending overseas finance. As the European Investment Bank, one of the world's largest multilateral lenders, is committed to ending all financing for oil, gas, and coal. And so this is part of a movement across the world to cut off the tap for fossil fuel finance, recognizing that we can address what we're extracting and burning at home, but we need to be addressing what we are then imposing on other countries, what we are financing on other countries. It's fine to take action at home, that is good, but then if we just export it to other countries, we're just recreating the problem. And so to see the U.S. take action after spending so much time meeting with people who've been directly impacted by these projects, whose stories are rarely told. These are oftentimes people who have very little access to the news media, to ways to get their story out. And they've essentially been forgotten. And the U.S. government has financed projects that have harmed and in some cases killed them. And so for the U.S. government to actually finally be taking what looks like strong action to address this and to stop this just unconscionable financing of fossil fuels overseas is exciting. But again, we have to hold their feet to the fire, because like many parts of the executive order, it directs agencies to take these actions, but it doesn't give specifics. It doesn't explain exactly how we're going to do this, and it doesn't set specific mandates. And so it is really up to us to watch our government, to make sure that the Biden administration doesn't cave to fossil fuel pressure, doesn't cave to the lies that are already coming out of the fossil fuel industry, saying that this is going to kill jobs, when in fact we know that continuing to rely on the boom and bust industry endangers workers. That when they're trying to say that that they don't actually get subsidies, that's a fun one. When the American Petroleum Institute tries to say that they don't get subsidies from the U.S. government, we need to be pushing back. We can't allow the fossil fuel industry to control the narrative and to allow those lies to take root. Because we've already seen members of Congress try to put out legislation to undo Biden's action, to undo these first steps. And instead, what we need to be doing is making sure that there's follow through, making sure that these changes become permanent, and making sure that they are the comprehensive change that we need to actually not just end our dependence on fossil fuels, but to actually start addressing the issues of justice, to actually repair and address the harm that's been created in communities, to invest in communities, and to once and for all base our economy on justice. And so I am excited for this. I'm excited to keep working with you on all this. And I am excited that we together are going to hold Biden's feet to the fire, and we're going to make sure that these changes are permanent, and we are going to win this. So thank you so much. And thank you for being here today.
Yay. Thank you so much, Nicole. Thank you so much. And now to discuss public lands, we have Terry Tempest Williams, a citizen writer who's written 17 books, including the environmental literature classic Refuge, an unnatural history of family and place. Another book, Finding Beauty in a Broken World, and When Women Were Birds, and the Hour of Land. And then most recently, she has Erosion, Essays of Undoing. And trust me, her books are real gems. You're going to want to read them if you haven't already. Known for her impassioned prose that integrate the poetics of place with an ethic of place, she continues to show us how environmental issues are economic issues, social issues, and ultimately issues of justice. We see through her writing that has been translated worldwide how the climate crisis is not just a political crisis, but a spiritual one. Terry Tempest Williams is currently writer in residence at the Harvard Divinity School, where she and her husband, Brooke Williams, divide their time between Cambridge, Massachusetts, and Castle Valley, Utah. Welcome, Terry.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you for bringing us together through your passionate activism and joy. We are here because of you. And deep gratitude to the Greenpeace team for this gathering with activists all over the world. The eyes of the future are looking back at us, and they are praying for us to see beyond our own time. President Biden and Vice President Harris understand the open space of democracy and what's at stake, that these public lands, wildlands, are a breathing space in a country that is increasingly holding its breath. By placing a moratorium on any and all new oil and gas leases on public lands and waters, they are saying that safeguarding the health of the environment is in fact the wealth of our communities. Tribal nations know these lands as their home ground. They've seen changes coming from climate collapse, and they know the protocols, and they are helping us redefine what public lands can mean and have meant from the beginning of time. For example, Jonah Yellowman, the spiritual advisor for Utah Diné Bikéyah, says, "We are not protecting Bears Ears for our people, but all people. It is a place of healing." The Biden administration, by executive orders, we know, is reviewing Bears Ears National Monument, sacred lands to the Diné, Hopi, Zuni, and Ute nations, alongside other monuments, to restore and revise the original boundaries that the past administration gutted, in Bears Ears' case by 85%. This is good news. But still, the open space of democracy is threatened, as Jane said in her beautiful introduction today. Fracking on public lands, fouling our precious water, especially in the desert, must stop. Fossil fuel extraction on public lands produces 25% of all carbon emissions in the United States. And if America's public lands, imagine this, were a nation, it would rank 5th in the world production of CO2 gases. Larry Rasmussen, a theologian and a climate activist, asks this question: can we love this earth enough to change? This is more than a political crisis or an ecological crisis. It is our spiritual reckoning. We have made the mistake of confusing democracy with capitalism and have mistaken political engagement with political machinery subject to corruption. It is time now to resist the simple utilitarian view that what is good for business is good for humanity in all its complex web of relationships. I do not believe we can look for leadership beyond ourselves. Each of us must look in the mirror and say, if I want the world to change, how must I change myself? 5 years ago, my husband Brooke and I attended an oil and gas lease sale in Salt Lake City with other activists. I can tell you we were sickened by what we saw and heard in the name of crass commerce. Knowing the character of these lands and loving them, we made a spontaneous decision to legally purchase 2 leases near our home on traditional Ute lands along the Colorado River. The leases included 1,120 acres that the Bureau of Land Management was selling for $1.50 an acre, less than a cup of coffee. We paid with our debit card and hoped it would hold it. We formed Tempest Energy Company, LLC, and we said publicly we would not develop the fossil fuels on these lands until science could prove to us that they were worth more above the ground than below. The Bureau of Land Management revoked our leases, saying we were violating the 1920 Minerals Leasing Act. We appealed their decision. We would later find out our leases were the first leases ever to be denied. Politics. I lost my job at the University of Utah. We were inspired years earlier by Tim DeChristopher, who in 2008 committed civil disobedience by disrupting an oil and gas lease sale, also in Salt Lake City. In his defense, he was a student at the University of Utah. He cited fossil fuel development on public lands was destroying the climate and his generation's chance for a livable future. He was arrested on felony charges and served 2 years in a federal prison.
Oh.
What is government and fossil fuel corporations and the institutions that are supported by them afraid of? That is my question. I believe they're afraid of change, and the world is changing. We are changing. I think they're afraid of a global movement of citizens who are devoted to the survival of life, not money, in the urgency of this moment. They are afraid of a new definition of energy, not fossil fuels, but an energy that fuels our spirit, the energy of a collective moral imagination that says we can choose to live differently. What can we do? Scientists tell us there are close to 40 million acres of wildlands that still need protection in the American West. Recognized as part of this planetary reserve, call it a refuge, that the Biden-Harris administration, and now with Deb Haaland, fingers crossed, has adopted in their 30-30 vision, 30% of land and waters protected by 2030. This is a bold initiative. Bills before Congress, like America's Red Rock Wilderness Act, is part of this vision, as is the Black Ram Climate Refuge proposal in Montana, and there are many others. We must honor and support co-management of these lands with tribal nations, land back. We can continue to encourage the Biden administration to think big, be brave, and act with the long view in sight, with an eye toward the loss of biodiversity, extinction, and climate collapse. We still have a chance. To care is neither conservative nor progressive. It is about consciousness. Heart is the first home of democracy. We are in need of a reflective activism born out of humility, not arrogance. Reflection in the consideration of others opens the door to being a compassionate participant in the world. As I share these words with you, meadowlarks have returned to the desert and are singing with the full force of their voices against the red cliffs beneath a blue sky, reminding us we are not the only species that lives and loves on this beautiful broken planet we call home.
Thank you so much, Terry, for those beautiful, beautiful, moving words. Thank you.
Outstanding.
To all of our amazing speakers, thank you so much, Nicole and Bryan and Rico. Thank you, and Cori. We talked today about the most important things the new administration needs to focus on and the various actions Biden administration can take to make the urgent changes needed to protect the climate and the future. Today, the climate movement is asking Biden to stop Line 3, the oil pipeline in northern Minnesota. The bulldozers have already arrived to plow through sacred wild rice watersheds, over 800 wetlands, and over 200 bodies of water in Ojibwe Treaty territory. Indigenous water protectors are fighting to protect their land, but the drones are overhead and the police are militarized, and we know what that looks like because of Standing Rock. President Biden has the power to stop this project and begin the transition process so the impacted workers won't be left without family supporting jobs. He can review the permits granted by Trump and halt Line 3 construction immediately. Biden has made great strides by canceling the Keystone XL pipeline, so we need to keep up the pressure so that other climate polluting projects like Line 3 and the Dakota Access pipelines that run through Standing Rock are also canceled. But with a just transition, always with a just transition for the workers. On next week's show, we're gonna dive in deeply into the history of Line 3 and the Dakota Access pipelines and hear from people actively fighting these projects. Fire Drill Friday and Greenpeace are partnering with several organizations to push the president to stop Line 3. We already have more than 130,000 signatures, and we need more. The coalition is going to be delivering these petitions to Biden in mid-February. Please, please add your voice now by going to firedrillfridays.com/take-action. Have a beautiful weekend. I hope you each find a time to take a few deep breaths, relax, and think about all the sacred lands and biodiversity and people that we're working together to protect. Thank you so much for joining today. Stay warm and safe and in community. See you next week. And I hope you newcomers will come back. Thanks.
Yay!